Hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So recently, my friends, my home state of Georgia has been in the news for a reason that I am not sure is good or bad. I suppose we will find out by the end of this video. But it's been in the news because Governor Brian Kemp recently signed SB 202, which was a bill passed by the Georgia legislature, which is meant, in the words of Brian Kemp and those who advocated for it, the bill's sort of progenitors. It is meant to secure the elections and to reform the electoral system, which many of these legislators view as inherently broken. Now, this move has been panned across the media in a very negative way, even among somewhat neutral outlets. So, CBS News, which is perhaps considered one of the most neutral, middle-of-the-road outlets in the United States, said Georgia Republicans passed sweeping voting restrictions, which automatically bequeath a negative connotation upon the reader who is interacting with that article. Or you have The Guardian, which is absolutely not at all neutral. In fact, it is quite far left. But they decided to pan and cover a Philadelphia Inquirer columnist who made a column about how apparently Brian Kemp's actions fall under the auspices of Jim Crow. And so, my friends, I don't want to talk about the bill too much today. Of course I will have to, because that is the story that connects what we're covering with the entire notion that I'm getting at here. I want to talk about the notion of voting rights and how certain issues are presented in a rhetorically beneficial way from another side or from a particular side to advance a notion that may not be close to the truth. Because, my friends, every issue, every piece of legislation has a manifest principle idea behind it. Politics, my friends, is nothing more than the manifestation and the process of dispensing principles through legislation, dispensing principles through that method by which those principles become codified and then enforced by the gun, enforced by the state's monopoly on the ability to enforce laws. That's all politics is, my friends. Many of us think that politics is the science of how human interaction takes care of people. Many of us think that politics is the science of how a government works, but fundamentally, at the very core root of all of those things that I just mentioned are humans, human interaction and human desire. So politics is the culmination of that. But in politics, human interaction and human desire are put around these parameters which are meant to guide the desire and the interaction. Insofar as it relates to ensuring good policy happens within the realm of legitimacy, and legitimacy being the realm of making sure that our rights are protected. So, there are two narratives that are emerging from this story right now. The left is saying that Kemp is a devil, whereas many on the right are saying that Kemp is a protector, and he is here to save us from a very fraudulent election or a very decrepit infrastructure surrounding voting. Look, I think both of these are particularly wrong. Kemp is not subversive insofar as the state has the right, or the government has the right to legislate its own processes. Elections are a process of the government, and we'll talk about voting rights in a moment, but elections are the process of the government. So I don't think he's being subversive in that he is simply doing something that is within his legislative power. Now, you can argue if this is a legitimate use of his power, if it is an ethical use of his power. I will deal with those arguments in a little bit. But I don't think he's being subversive in that he's not subverting anything. He's simply using a tool that is at his disposal. I'm not so sure he's being protective, because a protector of a general good, of a general idea of good, and for a governor's case, they're meant to protect rights or to make sure that efficiency happens. I don't think Kemp is being protective of the general legislative system. He's trying to change the general electoral system. So in that sense, he's kind of a changer than a protector. Perhaps he's changing it to protect it from something that he sees as a bad thing. But I think that it's very wrong. These sort of binary ideas that we have with these people. Okay, they're either good or bad. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes we need a lot more nuance than to simply group them into these two categories. Because if you group them into these two categories, what you do is you leave yourself susceptible to missing the truth. And at the fundamental core root of all of this is the truth. So, my friends, let me say something that is going to shock many of you and perhaps make some of you upset. Voting rights do not exist. There is no such thing as a right to vote. Why do I say this? Number one, rights are endemic to who you are as an individual. Rights are inherent to your human being. This is the conception of negative rights. The idea of positive rights is that rights are something that comes from you from the government. The government gives you the right to vote. They give you health care. They give you free housing. But the problem is, positive rights is simply an inversion of a principle of negative rights. See, negative rights came first, in my honest belief. The natural law tradition has been around with us since the ancient Greeks, since the Stoics, and of course the natural law tradition of the 17th century is very different than the ancient Greeks and the Stoics, but still they're in the same category. The idea of nature is so endemic to the foundation of Western civilization and the conceptualization of so many of the social mores and cultural mores that we hold to be true that form the foundation of government. And one of those, at least in the American context, of those cultural mores is simply an affirmation that our rights come from our nature. If voting is a right, then you're telling me that a right is not inherent to me, and that a process, a government, is free to modify my agency, modify my ability to be free in a social context. And that to me is a very dangerous statement. If rights are inherent to me, and rights are a outgrowth of my agency, and rights, therefore, confer upon me the ability to be morally responsible by saying, okay, there are things that I cannot do to you, there are things you cannot do to me, so we can both enjoy our freedom, our natural freedoms, separately. If that's what rights are, then voting can't be a right, because it is external to who we are as human beings. It is a process. It is something that was set up by a particular legislative apparatus, the Constitution. But be very clear, the Constitution didn't set up our natural rights. The Constitution protected our natural rights, my friends. So no, voting is not a right. It is a privilege. Now, of course, it is a very important privilege, but it is a privilege nonetheless. Because again, if voting is a right, then that means my rights can be easily written up by a government and taken away by government, and that is not a very stable ground to have. A country that was founded on the exact opposite notion, number one, and that is not a very coherent idea of rights for me, because in my opinion, rights don't therefore have no universal meaning. They have contingent meaning. And if they have contingent meaning, they really mean nothing. They're really just auxiliaries for some broader purpose. So, voting's not a right. It's a privilege. Now, it is a very important privilege, of course. It is a privilege that is indispensable to the operations of our great republic. It is a privilege. So, instead of viewing this as a right, because it's not a right, we should view voting in methods used to understand voting and to regulate voting through what I call a reasonability standard. Now, the reasonability standard has three parts to it. Number one, does this strengthen the privilege of voting? Does the action that is being taken towards voting strengthen it? Number two, do these metrics have a justified rationale behind them? And number three, does it inhibit the processes of the republic from working? Let me use a historical corollary here and explain as to why I think this example is sound. So, and why it also protects the privilege of voting from malicious intentions. So, literacy tests in the South were clearly used to disenfranchise African Americans from being able to vote. What it did is it put an undue standard on African Americans to learn particular items of history and conflated the understanding of that particular item of history with competency as a citizen. And in that, literacy tests were literally a confusion of what it meant to be an American citizen and a absolute disgrace of the notion of the American experiment, and that the notion of the American experiment was not simply about accumulating knowledge. The notion of the American experiment was the rejection of the king's pretension, rejection of the king's idea of knowledge, and a sort of solidification of the idea that regardless of our knowledge, regardless of our class, regardless of our social standing, we all have freedoms endemic to who we are, spiritually up in our DNA. So for that reason alone, literacy tests were invalid. But let's use my standard to see how they are invalid. Number one, did it strengthen the privilege? Actually, no. Literacy tests very clearly tried to confine the privilege to people, to a very select few people who may have known these obscure facts about American history, which had no bearing on their citizenship and no bearing on their ability to make competent decisions as a voter. That's number one. So no, it does not. It fails number one. Number two, do they have a justified rationale behind them? Of course not. They were clearly meant to disenfranchise people who didn't have a very core precept of knowledge, and there is no justified rationale that a voter should understand who particular historical figures are to be able to vote. Maybe voters should understand basic American civics, but even that is a little bit too much for me, because guess what? I think that you can get information through many means, and information can be expressed through many means, not just through a static, standardized test. So no, it fails the second test. Number three, does it inhibit the processes of the Republic from working? Absolutely, because guess what? It disenfranchises a group of people from a sizable group of people, from being able to participate in the Republic. So, for that reason, my standard would have destroyed the Jim Crow literacy tests that were so popular in the 60s. This is for anyone who might say, oh, Christian, your standard, how dare you not be voting as a right? Your standard is terrible. No, it's not. This would have destroyed the disenfranchisement efforts that were taking place across the South in the 50s and 60s. Now, let's apply this standard to some aspects of SB 202, the bill that Governor Kemp signed. I'm not going to make an exhaustive list of everything in the bill. I'm going to list probably about 5 things. Because this is not a commentary on the bill. This is a commentary on the principle that is being expounded through American politics. So, here's what the bill does. The bill does, I'm going to mention 5 things. Only 5 things. The bill does much more than that. I will link the bill in the description below if you want to see more, but I'm going to mention 5 things. Number 1, the bill ratchets up the requirements for absentee ballot voting. It does this by requiring a photo ID to vote by mail. So, absentee ballot voting has been the scorn of many conservatives for a very long while because they view it as a less secure method by which to dispense your vote. I don't entirely agree with this, but I understand where this position comes from. I don't necessarily think that voter ID laws are bad. I think that the concept is fine. If voting is a privilege, and we want the privilege to be exercised in a way that is laden with integrity, and integrity means being able to ensure the person who votes is actually the person who voted, then I have no problem whatsoever with voter ID laws. So, that's fine. And I don't mind having one to vote by mail. Now the idea is that black individuals will be disenfranchised because black people apparently don't have IDs. I disagree with this. And guess what? If this is the case, then Stacey Abrams, who is in Georgia, and other people across the country can easily go and begin to register black individuals to get government IDs. It's not that hard. Even if you don't have a driver's license, it's not that hard. So if this is really a material concern that black folks apparently don't have IDs, well, guess what? You need an ID to work. By the way, So if this is really a material concern, then go ahead and make sure that black folks can be able to have the IDs they need to be able to vote. Simple as that. And if they're going to vote by mail, make sure they have those requisite IDs. Simple as that. The problem is, a lot of progressives like to look at the problem, look at the thing, and say, okay, so like for example, it's estimated that voter ID laws apparently affected over 600,000 African Americans in Texas. Like say, okay, that's because black folks don't have IDs, or that's because black folks, or no, well, guess what? The same requirements for ID exist for white folks too. And if you're saying that white folks are more likely to have IDs, you're making a statement that is just absolutely unfounded in any truth. So that's number 1. Number 2, SB 202 limits where drop boxes can be placed and when they can be accessed. Now, it requires all counties to have one drop box, but it also limits the amount of drop boxes per county. Now, I think this is a little bit foolish. If there is like a county like Fulton County in Georgia that has a lot of people in it, you may want to have more than one drop box. If there's a county in rural South Georgia that doesn't have a lot of people in it, okay, that's fine. Now, what it also does is it extends the early voting period as well, and it basically confines your ability to use drop boxes to the early voting period. And during early voting, most people vote during early voting, but it's like spread out. And so during this spread out period, if we're concerned about a particular drop box being congested, okay, just go during early voting. You have an extra week or so of early voting according to this new bill. The most controversial is that it prevents volunteers from handing out food or water to voting lines, but allows them to set up self-serve stations. The solution to this is very simple. Number one, vote early, so you don't have to stand in line. Number two, go to the self-serve station before you get in line, and then go drink up at the line. Or number three, you can just vote by mail, which is still possible if you have a photo ID. And really, I mean, this is... There's solutions to this, but is this really our standard, right? Does this strengthen the privilege? Not really. Does this have a justified rationale behind them? Not really. Does it inhibit the processes of the public from working? Not really. So the standard is kind of neutral on this one. Whereas for number two, it also is a little bit against that. And for number one, I think the standard is okay with it. But number four, but the bill also extends the time period for early voting, as I mentioned before. So this actually, by my metric that I got out here, is perfect. It's perfect. So yes, my metric does absolutely justify this. And number five, it prevents local governments from sending unsolicited absentee ballot applications. Look, I think people should have to solicit their ballot applications. They should have to ask, for their right to participate, or their desire to participate, not right. So I don't see a problem with this. So there are many more things this bill does, but I'm not going to go over all of them because this is not a commentary on the bill, this is a commentary on the principle. Now, look, I think my metric would largely say this bill is okay, I guess. It's okay. There are some things that are clearly done for political purposes, and there are other things that I think are eminently usable and essential if we're going to have a public that is confident in the systems that allow our public to operate. My friends, when you have a good majority of people who are still not confident that Joe Biden is not the president of the United States, the legitimate president of the United States, regardless of if they're correct or incorrect, you have to address a lingering issue within the voting system. Now, do I believe the election was stolen? I don't. That's not my battle to get into. That's not my battle to get into. And my analysis is not based on that. My analysis is based on the principle of this matter. But now, there is a certain ontology that is being advanced by the left on this issue. And by ontology, I simply mean a state of being, an idea of being. Gloria Butler, who is the minority leader of the Georgia Senate, Gloria Butler, she, the Democrat from Georgia, she said that, and I quote, that we are witnessing voter suppression tactics, and we are witnessing right now a massive and unabashed assault on voting rights unlike anything we've seen since the Jim Crow era. So, when progressives invoke Jim Crow to attack voter ID requirements and voting reform laws, two things are happening in that sort of space. They're making a statement of philosophical principles, and they're using a rhetorical device. Let's start with the rhetorical device. The rhetorical device, my friends, is the idea that if you can invoke a period as wretched and wicked as Jim Crow, you can make anything else that it stands in proximity to in your invocation seem bad. So, for example, if I can say, oh my, this unrelated law here that has nothing to do with Jim Crow inherently is like Jim Crow, I can make most people say, ugh, Jim Crow, bad law. But this, of course, is a straw man. It's both a straw man and a red herring, because it does not speak to the substance of what is happening, independent of the historical reality that occurred 60, 70 years before that substance. You should only compare a measure to Jim Crow if it is indeed comparable to Jim Crow. But Jim Crow is not merely actions. Jim Crow was a statement of intentions. My God, Jim Crow was a statement of intentions that manifested through actions. Intentions matter, and intentions will ultimately infuse themselves into actions. Intentions will ultimately become the action themselves. The intention here, obviously, is not to bar black folks from voting. The intention is probably, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, probably to stave off claims of election fraud or to put more integrity into the system. Regardless of what your opinion on those things are, they are not at all related to disenfranchising millions of black folks from being able to vote. So the rhetorical device is meant to disable any dissent towards the opinion of the person who opposes the bill. It's a rhetorical device. And it's also a statement of principles. Gloria, Butler, and many progressives generally believe that black folks are constantly plagued by the specter of Jim Crow, and that almost everything the system does, since the system once promoted Jim Crow, must be tinged with racism. For Gloria Butler, the black individual lives in a space and a place where they are constantly assaulted by the enemies of their being, by the specter of racism, and everything has to be viewed through that. Everything in its likeness has to be viewed through that reductive lens. So not only is she using rhetoric to try to disable dissent from her opinions, she's also binding African Americans to a false ontology that we are eternally victims, and that every action that pertains to us, either loosely or incidentally, must be looked at through the paradigm of us being Jim Crow, people assailed by Jim Crow. That's what Gloria Butler's doing. That's what progressives are doing. My friends, we have to break free from these illusory arguments. We have to break free from these false arguments. We are nothing more than people who manifest intentions, who manifest principles. That's why it's so important to use your God-given faculty of reason to blaze a light through these false arguments. My friends, I'm not saying SB 202 is perfect. I'm not even saying I support SB 202. In all honesty, I wouldn't have put a lot of stuff in the bill that's in the bill right now. I probably wouldn't have even considered the bill at this very precarious point in American politics. I wouldn't have even signed the bill. And this, maybe. Nah, I probably wouldn't even sign the bill. But that's not the point here, my friends. The point here, my friends, is very simple. What kind of reality do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a reality where your rights are assumed to be a part of you, or where they are given to you? Do you want to live in a reality where you as a black individual or whatever minority you are plagued by what happened in the past to people who look like you and held to that standard in the future? Or where you can blaze your own future, blaze your own light, blaze your own destiny with the brilliance that is bound up in your mind, the sanctity of your mind, as Emerson would say. What kind of reality do you want to live in? My friends, I know what I want to live in. I know what I want. I know what Christian Watson wants. And Christian Watson wants nothing more than to ensure the principles of the system that he interacts with on a daily basis, the government, are pure of intentions and founded on that divine truth that all men are created equal, and that we have certain rights that are inalienable, not prescriptive, that are inalienable, not given to us, that are inalienable, not granted to us. That's what I want, and I promise you we will get there one day. So as you consider SB 202, consider what I have said, my friends, but as always, I love you. If you want to support my work, and I hate doing this because it's kind of self-serving, but it's important. If you want to support my work, I need your help. Donate to me on Patreon at patreon.com/officialcwatson. And it would help me. Whatever you can donate would help me a lot, because this message is dynamite, and we have to get this message out there. As always, my friends, I love you, and please, forever and eternally, stay pensive. Bye-bye.